sweet friends! Today we are going to be reading Folks Call Me Appleseed John by Andrew Glass. When I was still a young man, I walked barefoot across the Allegheny Plateau and began planting apple seeds in the wilderness. I sold my seedlings to settlers right there on the frontier. Before long, even if folks had nothing else, they had an orchard. They could eat apples right from their own trees, make apple butter and apple cider, and dry what was left to sustain them in winter. My business prospered, and one day I wrote a letter to my half-brother back in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Dear Nathaniel, I am making a comfortable living here on French Creek. There is plenty of work for two, and I would welcome your company. Please come soon. Your half-brother, John. I carried the letter to Mr. Hale's trading post. Nathaniel rode with the settler's wagon west to Fort Pitt and made the last leg of his journey up the Allegheny River from Fort Pitt to French Creek by flatboat. On the way, they teased him some. I hear tell that your brother John wears a pot for a hat, they'd say, and just a burlap sack instead of clothes. Instead of listening to such foolishness, Nathaniel might better have spent his time learning something useful about life in the wilderness. When he finally arrived on French Creek, I wasn't far off. You can climb ashore right here, Sonny, I heard the boatman shout. Then I heard Nathaniel ask, but where's the house, and where's my big brother, John? I expect your big brother's off in the woods someplace discursion with squirrels, chuckled the boatman. And I'll just betcha a pig in a poke that big ol' hollow sycamore tree is your new house. Watch out for Injuns, Sonny, I heard that fool shout as he pushed off, leaving poor Nathaniel alone. If the boy's ears had worked as well as a boy's ears ought to, he'd have heard me right there behind him. But when I picked him up and swung him around like a straw scarecrow, he looked as though he'd been snatched up by the spirit world. Bless you, Nathaniel, I said gently. Fear no evil, I'm your brother John. Nowadays, folks call me Appleseed John. I made a fire and boiled some cornmeal into mush. Nathaniel didn't like the look of it, but he gobbled up his share and most of mine like a half-starved mongrel dog. Then he made himself comfortable inside our cozy sycamore tree. There was a commodious bed of leaves and blankets that I didn't use, much preferring, as I still do, to sleep under the stars. Over the next days, we began gathering nuts and berries. We stored our provisions in hinged boxes to keep friendly critters from helping themselves. We wandered all through the forest, preparing our seedlings to weather the bitter cold. Autumn ended abruptly that year with an early snowstorm. At first, we decorated our camp with snow angels and built ice tentacles along the creek. In the evening, I read to Nathaniel as we discussed the great ideas contained in our books. We talked of planting and harvesting apple trees in the spring. At night, I slept like a bear. But Nathaniel soon grew discontented. He huddled inside the sycamore, wrapped in every stitch of warm clothing he had carried from Massachusetts, and munched nuts and dried fruit. This isn't exactly what I expected, he complained. I'm freezing. I wish we had a proper house with a solid door and a stove. The worst of it was that all of his munching soon depleted our stores. Before long, we had no more than 3 fingers worth of dried fruit and nuts left in the hinged boxes. There wasn't anything to do but risk canoeing down river to Fort Pitt, where I could purchase enough to feed us both until spring. Why can't I come along too? Nathaniel asked. River travel can be dangerous in winter, I explained, wrapping myself in a blanket and pulling a small pot from its peg. It's much safer here. You're not planning to wear that mush pot on your head? Nathaniel asked. Sure am, I replied. It's more useful than any hat. It keeps my head dry, I can cook in it, and once I used it to discourage an unreasonable copperhead. Ain't much a man need fear when he's got a mush pot on his head. I started paddling rapidly down the half-frozen Allegheny, but big chunks of floating ice made it rough going. Finally, in the late afternoon, I pulled my canoe up on top of a huge cake of ice and stretched out. Comfortable as a duke, I closed my eyes for a short nap. When I felt the morning sun full on my face, I knew right away I must have floated past the fort during the night. A blanket of freshly fallen snow covered me. I made my way to shore, praying that Nathaniel hadn't foolishly gobbled up his meager provisions. But in my heart, I was sure that's exactly what he'd done. I couldn't just paddle back up the icy river, and I was nearly frozen myself. The first thing I needed was shelter. I dragged my canoe up the riverbank. Using it as a windbreak, I made a fire and warmed myself. I wrapped my bare feet with strips torn from my blanket. Then I waded into the deep snow and cut long, drooping branches from a birch tree. I warmed the branches over the fire until they were soft and wove them into crude snowshoes. I tied them to my feet with moose bark. Once I had put out the fire and buried my canoe in the underbrush with every intention of returning in the spring, I began the long journey north to where the Allegheny River meets the Monongahela. When it grew dark, I cooked some frozen berries and nuts into mush in my tin pot and slept in a hollow log. The next day, I came upon a lean gray wolf caught in a cruel trap. She regarded me with golden eyes full of hatred and suspicion. I personally have always been on the best of terms with God's wild creatures, and my name, it seems, is widely known among them. God bless you, madam, I said. Fear no evil, I'm Appleseed John. Then I gently removed the trap. I tended her through the evening and into the night, washing her wound with snow, and fell asleep to the soft drumming of her heartbeat. I dreamed of poor Nathaniel shivering in his icy bed. I saw ashes where his fire should have been, and more worrisome still, I saw 4 braves stealily creeping toward him along French Creek. I woke with a start, sure that my vision was more than just any ordinary dream. There in the darkness, I prayed to the angels. Indians had never done me any harm, and I never took anything that belonged to them. But it riled them to see folks settling on their land. In the morning, I trudged on north. My companion limped alongside. We passed several remote cabins. I stopped long enough at the first to ask her something warm to wear. Any old thing, I said. Those folks had nothing to spare but a moth-eaten old Mother Hubbard. I pulled it over my head gratefully and hurried along through the snow. I guess we made an odd sight, my companion and I. Folks didn't call out or even wave. They just stood, wide-eyed, and watched us pass. When we reached the clearing beyond the fort, I urged my friend to return to the deep woods, for I feared the soldiers would shoot her. By the time the sleepy sentry saw me, I was nearly through the gate. Who goes there? He kind of squeaked. Bless you, soldier, I replied. Fear no evil, I'm Appleseed John. He rubbed his eyes and waved me right on in, though I was ragged and peculiar looking, and, I expect, smelled worse than a wild pig. At the general store, I purchased beans and blankets, dried fruit and preserves, flour, long woolen underwear, mittens, and even English tea. I found a small bundle of books waiting that I'd ordered from Philadelphia. I stumbled back through the front gate, past the sentry, and into the snow with enough necessities and comforts to keep us warm and well fed until spring. You'd best watch out for Injuns, John, a soldier shouted down from the stockade. There's been talk of trouble up your way. I shouted back over my shoulder, remember that God put us here to be as brothers and sisters and stewards of the earth. I soon stumbled upon a muley steer. The beast scraped with its hooves through the snow to the frozen earth and blew a blast of hot steam, like a geyser, from his nostrils. I only narrowly avoided his charge by jumping right out of my snowshoes to a low-hanging branch, leaving my provisions behind in the snow. Bless you, sir. Fear no evil, I said, though I was hanging helplessly overhead. I'm Appleseed John. Fortunately, he had heard of my Appleseed John, who found new homes for beasts abandoned in the wilderness. He allowed me to climb down and strap my bundle to his strong back. That accommodating steer and I plodded north along the river. We kept going through the evening and into the night, past remote cabins with glowing windows. They looked snug and warm, but we didn't slow down or rest until I arrived home. I saw just what I feared, 5 braves sitting cross-legged around a blazing fire in front of our hollow sycamore tree. One waved his bow wildly in the air while the other shrieked and whooped. I crept forward more silently than a snake, hoping to frighten them away and save Nathaniel. I was all but invisible until I leapt into the firelight, all flapping rags and mushpot hat. They jumped to their feet all right, startled, just as they'd seen a ghost. But instead of fleeing, all 5 stood their ground. My heart was beating like a war drum. Bless you all, I said. Fear no evil. The braves stood silently as stones. My voice trembled. I'm John. Appleseed John, they shouted and laughed and hooted. We've been waiting for you. Then I recognized Nathaniel. He had feathers in his hair and held a hunting bow. I threw my arms around my little brother and we laughed together. Young Snake, Bottle Beaver, 20 Canoes, and Old Half-Tongue turned out to be angels after all. They were Senecas who had found Nathaniel starved and nearly frozen. They had saved his life and taught him to hunt small game with the bow and arrows he had made himself. That's their way. Folks soon came and settled up and down French Creek. Nathaniel stayed on, but I preferred pass through the forest over town roads, so I moved west again, ahead of the settlers, into the Ohio wilderness, carrying a bag filled with apple seeds. The end. I hope you enjoyed that story.